Welcome. Yes, I've got it. Yep. Welcome everyone to our annual public lecture, the Noel Butlin Lecture. My name's Lionel Frost. I'm the President of the Economic History Society of Australia and New Zealand. And we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands that we live and work on. It's my sincere hope that our research, which in turn informs our teaching, will build understanding and knowledge across cultures that will be to the mutual benefit of those cultures. And also my sincere hope that through our teaching, our education will build opportunities for Indigenous people to live healthy, safe and rewarding lives. Before the lecture itself, I want to say a few words announcing two major prizes, two major awards that the Society makes. Number one is the annual award that we've now made for 5 years, which is a Distinguished Service Award for in recognition of a contribution to economic history in Australia and New Zealand. And this is the EHSANZ Award. It's my pleasure to announce that this year's award is to Jeffrey G. Williamson. I've been in contact with Jeff and he is absolutely delighted, but says he was unable to join us. As I'm sure we all know, Jeff's contribution to economic history worldwide, but also to Australia and New Zealand, has been enormous. And those of us who've been have been fortunate enough to work with Jeff or to just have Jeff comment on a conference presentation or a paper will attest to Jeff's level of enthusiasm and his generosity. We also have last year's winner of the Shan Award, David. There's David. Give us a wave, David. Yep. Congratulations also to David. And I caught up with David during the year and was able to make a presentation to him, which was very nice. Second announcement is the Society Prize for the best paper published in Australian Economic History Review in the past year, as judged by the editorial board, sorry. And the prize for this year is to, there's Lara. Hi, Lara. Lara Panzer and Jeff Williamson's paper on income inequality in Australia. So can we give a round of applause for Lara, please? Yeah. Thank you. That prize is sponsored by Wiley, the publisher of the journal. So we'll be in touch with you regarding that. Pardon me. Now, before we go further, a rather solemn announcement, and that is that on behalf of the Society, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the sad passing of Stuart McIntyre, who was a great scholar, great person, and a terrific friend for economic history. And Stuart worked with Allison on the Cambridge history of Australia, and Stuart's loss will be deeply felt. So we pay our respects to Stuart and pass on sympathies to Allison and Stuart's friends and family. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Allison, Professor Alison Bashford, as our Noel Butlin public lecture speaker. I've done some research and I've discovered that we first had a Butlin lecture in 2004. So there's a very strong tradition of eminent people who have been invited to give our keynote public address at our conferences. Previous lecturers include Jeff Williamson, also Paul Johnson. Our last face-to-face Butlin lecture was in 2000 at ANU. That was Deborah Oxley. And last year, our lecturer was Sasha Becker. So before I introduce Alison, I'd just like to say a few words about Noel Butlin, why it is that the Society chose back in 2004 to name its public lecture after Noel, and also to give some information to younger people who may not be fully aware of Noel's contribution. So Noel George Butlin was Professor of Economic History in the Research School of Social Sciences at ANU from 1962 to 1982. He was born in Singleton in New South Wales in 1921. He was from a working class family. His father was a railway porter and his parents had emigrated from Birmingham. With his brother Sid, who was also a great scholar, Noel attended state high schools, and Noel and Sid both took honours degrees in economics from the University of Sydney. Sid ended up as a professor at the University of Sydney. After wartime public service in Britain and America, Noel had a short spell at Harvard before returning to Australia to take up a position at RSSS at ANU, and so began a 40-year career in researching and writing about Australian economic history. When Keith Hancock was appointed director of RSSS in 1957, one of his first initiatives was to develop a multidisciplinary seminar on the theme of wool. And one of these early seminars, Noel Butlin, still a young emerging scholar, used a blackboard to sketch an interpretation, a revolutionary interpretation of Australian economic history. Noel had developed, or was developing, estimates of national production, investment and trade based on the official colonial statistics, but supplemented by institutional and company records that he had been completing. And Noel argued that after 1860, there were four main sources of economic growth in Australia: pastoral production, transport, chiefly railways, housing, chiefly in cities, and service activity, also chiefly in cities. And this interpretation positions Australia as not just an appendage of the international economy, but one in which individual entrepreneurs were able to make their own decisions, taking advantages of opportunities presented by British capital and by British markets. So Noel's investment in Australian economic development, published by Cambridge University Press in 1964, was the product of more than a decade's work. It's a work of enormous scope that really lays the foundation for the study of economic history in Australia. After that, Noel turned his interests to other aspects of Australian economic history, including history of economic policy and the interaction between governments and the private sector. His book, Government and Capitalism, written with Jonathan Pincus and Alan Barnard. He wrote on the economic development of Botany Bay and its environmental impact. And until his death, he was working on the impact of European colonisation on Australian Indigenous people. He kept working hard despite his poor health, literally until the time of his death, hoping to complete an economic history of Australia that spanned over 60,000 years until the gold rush. Some of the work that this was based on was published after his death in 1991. There's an excellent obituary of Noel Butlin written by Graham Snooks in the 1991 issue of Australian Economic History Review. Snooks writes, Noel had a strong and passionate concern for the progress of humanity. And that really sums up well, I think, the motivation for a lot of Noel's work. His concern was that ordinary people, Indigenous, non-Indigenous Australians, would have access to the opportunities that economic growth presented. His scholarly approach spanned a range of disciplines. Noel has influenced urban historians, environmental historians, historians of Indigenous Australia, and in fact, hardly anyone who has written on Indigenous and settler colonial Australia has not cited Noel's work. I met Noel several times as a young, frankly, terrified scholar making my way, and I disagreed with Noel a couple of times in print, and so when I met him I was trembling, but he was warm, he was generous, he welcomed debate, he welcomed the free exchange of views. He could be warm and genial, he could be blunt, he could be ruthless. I wonder sometimes how we would cope with a current day parking app at an Australian university. Noel was notorious for parking wherever he wanted. His intellectual legacy is enduring. He established part of the archival collection that he established of company records is now the Noel Butlin Archive Centre. And the Society hopes that this lecture will help to perpetuate Noel's legacy. Not only his legacy, but the legacy of inquiry that he helped to set up, that has been so influential on many of us who work on Australian topics. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Alison Bashford, the subject of her lecture being Gender and Classical Political Economy. Allison is the Laureate Professor of History at University of New South Wales, and she's also the Director of the Laureate Centre for History and Population. Previously, she was Vere Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History at the University of Cambridge. Her most recent books include An Intimate of Evolution, The Huxleys in Nature and Culture. Must be due out soon, Alison, or is it out already?
October.
I cannot wait to see that. And with Joyce Chaplin, The New World of Thomas Robert Malthus, which I cannot wait to read. Also noted that Allison was co-editor of the Cambridge History of Australia, a task that must have involved enormous effort, and Simon here did the same job on our smaller Cambridge Economic History of Australia. But Allison, Stuart told me once that you were the one who cracked the whip on that. So thank you.
Take that as a Stuart McIntyre comment.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Alison Bashford. So Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And I shall share this. All good? Great.
All good.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm speaking today from Gundungurra country, which is in the beautiful Southern Highlands of New South Wales. And I do need to indicate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners, if there are any, that there are sections of this lecture necessarily recounting early 19th century views that may offend. I want to dedicate this lecture, if I may, to the late Jeff Harcourt. Jeff was a fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, which was also the college of Thomas Robert Malthus. And as a fellow of that college as well myself, Jeff Harcourt and I spent many late hours together in what's called the Old Library of Jesus College, Cambridge, which holds Thomas Robert Malthus's personal library. And so to the late and great Jeff Harcourt, this is for you. Can I also say thank you very much, Lionel, for that introduction. And as the deliverer of this year's Noel Butlin lecture, and in the light of what you said about the wonderful Stuart McIntyre, as you were talking, I can remember very distinctly editing those 2 volumes with Stuart. We brought about 67, 68 Australian historians together. But I can remember so distinctly editing and having debates with Stuart McIntyre about the many, many Noel Butlin citations of all of those books that you mentioned and more, and having long discussions with Stuart about which edition, in fact, we should record in the Cambridge History of Australia. So not only was Noel Butlin, of course, deep inside the Cambridge History of Australia volumes that I edited with Stuart McIntyre, but certainly part of my conversation with Stuart. So thank you for the invitation to speak, especially as I'm not an economic historian, but I do pass occasionally as an intellectual historian of economic ideas. And I'm very struck as I've been listening to your papers, especially aware of the data and digitization theme of the conference. I'm a very ecumenical historian, and I think I read widely across many sub-disciplines in the history field. But I'm deeply interested, as are many of us, in historical methodology, and listening to and watching your data being presented. I'm struck yet again about the kind of degrees of difficulty, if I can put it that way, between economic history as presented here in your conference and actually the far lesser degree of difficulty of being an intellectual historian of economic writers, where our data is essentially the text. And so I'm very struck by, yet again, by the great degrees of difficulty, actually, and even complexity in our different methodologies. But I have over the years worked in and around history of economic ideas, most recently drawn back to classical political economy by my work on Malthus. And I remain fascinated with his work. Like many of us, we write the book and we think that's the end of the story, but these historical actors and historical questions are never put to bed by our books, in my experience. They keep on returning. And I do remain fascinated by his work, not in order to participate in a conversation about the rightness or wrongness of his thesis on population and resources and subsistence, but I'm more interested because that book, originally from 1798, and then, as you will know, vastly enlarged from 1803 onwards, the way in which it's endured as a benchmark really intrigues me. And it's especially interesting because it's endured across really massively diverse global polities and cultures and languages, you know, across India and China, Japan, Australia. It's endured for leaders and policymakers across time, whether they admit to it or not, from Nehru to Mao to Deakin. And it's endured, of course, for the world's key global thinkers, from Mill to Marx to Keynes. And we know that this is not just true of the past. For better or worse, experts and lay commentators, politicians, the public, proponents and opponents continue to benchmark their views against this initially quite modest text from 1798, which is quite remarkable. And I think that in some ways, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is one of the few comparable enduring texts. But I'm also, you know, perhaps profoundly as a historian, deeply interested in Malthus's writing circa 1803. So the moment when he's teaching Adam Smith to his many generations of students in the East India Company College, the era when he's reading accounts of colonization in New South Wales, as we'll see, the era when he's reading for himself the work of Wollstonecraft and Godwin and so forth. So Malthus in his early 19th century moment intrigues me more than anything. And this is very much what framed the book from 2016, The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus, written with Joyce Chaplin, in which we focused on really little discussed chapters on New Worlds, on Australian Aboriginal people, on Native Americans, and on South Sea Islanders. And that's what drove this book forward, was, for me, the quite surprising, I was about to say the word discovery, but it was always there, discovery to me, that there was a chapter in the famous essay on the principle of population, specifically dedicated to Aboriginal people in colonial New South Wales. That was a real surprise to me, and it drove forward what became this book. That chapter, the next one on Native Americans, and a third chapter on South Sea Islanders. There is a tradition, a publishing tradition, of omitting those chapters for still slightly mysterious reasons. Those three chapters were often omitted from many 19th century editions of this book. And that tradition continued through a lot of 20th century publication of the essay on the principle of population, which has never been out of print. But these three chapters were often omitted, which is why it came as such a surprise to me. And that's the basis behind the book that I wrote with Joyce Chaplin. We also wrote about the strange and intriguing absence of discussion of his contemporary slave trade and of Malthus's changing arguments about the usefulness of immigration and immigration schemes as a check to population. In fact, he changed his mind over many editions about that. The more I read his essay, the more I understand it actually as a world economic history with discussion of almost everywhere, from India to China, from Japan to Norway, from France to Easter Island. After the last wonderful session, I suddenly realized that I wasn't aware of whether, or I couldn't recall whether Malthus actually wrote about Siam. I thought he had, but in a quick look back in the break, I don't think he did. But this essay is a vast world history for sure, and I like to think of it now as a kind of a foundational world economic history. The principle of population, he argued, of course, worked in all places and all times, and it was a law. The whole purpose of the long essay from 1803, the long version of the book, was to substantiate this, to demonstrate evidence of this law working in all places and all times. hence the world history, or in his era, the universal history tradition, in which he wrote. The model available to Malthus when he approached his ambition to write, to demonstrate, really, to substantiate his claim that his principle of population operated in all place and all time, really the only model available to him in order to do that was the stadial model of universal history, the kind of 4-stage universal history that was bedded down in the Scottish Enlightenment and deployed by William Robertson, by Keynes, by Adam Smith, as well as in the French tradition of Montesquieu and so forth. Malthus inherited this as his world history model, and then he found all kinds of sources to help him with detail regarding fertility and mortality, food provisions, and perhaps most importantly, different mechanisms for the management of land in different times and places all over the world. Well, today I want to revisit his essay again, and it's lovely to have the opportunity to do so. And I want to set out in more detail something that's been implicit here and there in my work on Malthus, but I've never really addressed it specifically. And that is how what we call gender, but he never did or could, how what we call gender was his own explicit object of inquiry. Well, at one level, it's no news that sex and reproduction is core business of Malthus's essay. That's no news at all. In fact, historiographically, it's recently been far more exciting to read the essay, not for the question of sex, fertility, even mortality and reproduction, but actually in terms of land, in environmental history, times and terms, all of that fascinating assessment of global wasteland, of cultivated land, the possibility of cleared land that came with settler colonialism, and he definitely writes about that. His discussion of Chinese manuring of land that led to so many harvests a year, he was enormously impressed by that. And his future speculations about what would be possible if all of his own island, as he put it, was like a garden. So it's entirely true that his book is at least as much about the fertility of soil as the fertility of women. And that's a tagline that I used in my global population book, which came out before the Malthus book. But this is my opportunity to go back to the famous essay, not with land at the forefront, which is really how that really governed the global population book that I wrote and the New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus book. Now I want to go back and think about the famous essay with gender, which is in fact in plain sight in this essay. So in some ways, and I'm methodologically again, it's entirely straightforward because open any page of the essay, and in fact it's about what men and women do, sometimes about land, sometimes with regard to each other. So in a way, the data here, if I can even call it that in the light of the sophistication of what I've been hearing, is in plain sight. And this talk prepares me for possibly a wider analysis coming in the future of the classical canon's interest in population and therefore in gender. And so that's something that I'm thinking about moving towards is another think through of the classical political economy canon, perhaps from, well, certainly from Smith to Mill, but perhaps even earlier and later around the question of population, and watch how gender comes in and out of that. Well, there's one other, before I start, there's one other element of the essay that I've noted before, as have others, but its significance is slowly creeping up on me. Malthus's comparisons of marriage and labour and agricultural conventions across the world for some commentators and historians have marked him as an early ethnographer, sometimes an early anthropologist, and I think, in fact, they're entirely valid ways of seeing him. But I'm coming to see him, in fact, much more as a social historian, doing a kind of a history from below before its time. When he casts back, as he does, for a moment, in a few pages early in the long edition, and I'll come to that in a minute, he functions as a momentary historiographer, and he talks about how previous writers have done history and history of the world, and he sees a real problem with it. He sees them all as problematically accounts of the elite, accounts of the higher classes, he says, but these are not the people that Malthus is interested in at all. Rather, he wants to document the conduct and the experience of those close to want or misery, as he puts it. This is his explicit ambition in his book, and he sets himself completely apart from what he sees as the prior writers of world history. It's not the rich, but the poor, and what they do day to day in their ordinary lives that he's trying to get to, and that in fact he sets out in all of his volumes. So these days I think of him less as an early ethnographer, an early anthropologist, and actually rather more as a kind of an original social and economic historian in that I want to say Cambridge tradition, because in my years in Cambridge, I became very interested in, we're all interested as we move across the world and listen to different kinds of historical scholarship. I was deeply interested in what work comes under Cambridge social and economic history. And I hear it again today, and yesterday in many of the talks. And in a very counterintuitive and strange way, I see Malthus's essay as an attempt, highly flawed in data measures, and I'll come to that, but an attempt in a way to catch that version of social and economic history. All right, so to show and explain what Malthus had to say about gender, I'm going to cut his famous essay two ways. First, I'll look at the essay as he organized it, which is to say geographically, as you can see here, and as it happens temporally and historically. The checks to population in the less civilized parts of the world and in past times. This is a stadial exposition from so-called primitive to mercantile and commercial economies. That's how he sets out his universal history. I'll explain the work that gender did in the chapters on what he calls, quote unquote, the lower stage of mankind, chapter on New Holland, a chapter on Native America, and a chapter on the Pacific Islands. And these are his little studied earliest chapters, as I said, that formed the book with Joyce Chaplin, but that are little studied because they're often not to be found in reproductions of his book. And on that note, I just want to remind everybody, although I'm sure as economic historians you all know this, that there is a very short anonymous edition in 1798. And note the subtitle there. So that's the response to Godwin and Condorcet. And that's anonymous, and it's, at 50 pages or so. And it sells out straight away. So John Johnson, the radical publisher, asks for another one, and he asks for a much enlarged book, and that appears in 1803. And it's about 10 times as long. It's a completely different book. And it's still called An Essay on the Principal Population. It's got a completely different subtitle. And it's, he says, a new edition, very much enlarged. And this time he puts his name on it by T.R. Malthus, Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge. And this is the one that is reproduced reprinted perhaps, I used to know all this, perhaps 5 times in his lifetime up until 1826. And this is the edition in which he has this table of contents. He's starting from what he calls less civilized parts of the world, and in past times through to the history of civilized nations, as he calls it. So I'm going to cut it first by looking at those first 3 chapters, and then I'm going to just work through 3 economic and social complexes which were important to his thesis and impossible actually for him to consider without what we call gender. First, marriage, family and households. Second, I'll foreground what Malthus had to say about men and masculinity in war, another check, remember. And finally, really briefly, what he had to say about primogeniture and inheritance of land, which I'm interested in reading. This is gender in plain sight. Of course, we all know that inheritance of land in this era is about inheritance between father and sons, but rather than just saying that, I'm trying now to explicitly gender that, so to say. This is also part of how Thomas Robert Malthus writes about gender on almost every page of this famous essay. Okay, so let me look at the first of his stages of civilization, his account of the economies of hunter-gathering societies, so-called savage economies. Already by this time, okay, brackets there just for a moment. One of the important things for me as someone who's come to economic history rather than grown up in, so to say, economic history. In fact, my training is in medical history. And I just want to add for the moment how important it's been for me to recalibrate my understanding of stadial theory, which for 19th century medical historians is in a standard way biologized. You know, it's understood to be part of racist biology in the 19th century. You know, and it is in 1,000 ways, that's true. But how important it is for me to understand stadial theory from so-called savage or primitive societies to shepherd societies, you know, up to commercial societies, to fully understand, to in a way divest myself of that 19th century medical history training and rethink that stadial theory absolutely squarely as economic. And that might sound a strange thing to say to economic historians, but it's been, when I speak in conferences to people who are schooled in much more in 19th century racial biology or medical history or histories of anthropology, it's really hard for them to divest that kind of biologizing of all of this and to understand that, you know, for Malthus and for Smith or for Montesquieu, these stages are fundamentally economic in the first instance. Okay, so already by Malthus's time, it was standard to use the treatment of women as an index of civilization in the stadial model. And this is something that appears throughout the Scottish and French Enlightenment, as you would know, in the tradition of the 4-stage theory of human history. From Montesquieu to William Robertson to Smith, and Malthus inherited it and he redeployed it. Well, Malthus received most of his information on Aboriginal people in New South Wales on this chapter here, although he begins it with Tierra del Fuego, actually. He receives most of his information from Collins's detailed account of the colony of New South Wales. And this chapter here is perhaps a predictable description of savage violence exercised by men over women, the cruel treatment of their women, he says. Quote, "The prelude to love in this country is violence and of the most brutal nature." And he's quite critical. Quote, "The union of the sexes takes place at an early age, and instances were known to our colonists of very young girls having been much and shamefully abused by the males." And Malthus nominates what he calls the superiority of the males, and he details in, to some extent, and it's mainly drawn from Collins, what this superiority of the males means for the unfortunate women. Well, given that this, in fact, is it's chapter 3 in his long edition, but actually it's the substantive start of the book. The earlier 2 chapters repeat the 1798 edition. They set out the premise and the thesis for the principal population. And this chapter 3 is where he starts his history of the world. So given that this is the start of his book, the explicit discussion of men and of women and of their power relations is important, and it sets the expectation for the rest of his volumes. But the purpose was not simply to describe, but to think through what those kinds of relations between men and women in this instance actually meant for fertility and mortality. What were their effects? The whole fascinating question for Malthus, of course, we know, was how populations were kept low. By what means were populations kept low? By what means was the human potential to double and double again really quickly, by what means did that in fact never happen? These are the famous checks. And we know, many of you I know probably know more than me, that the major misunderstanding of Malthus is that he's someone who wrote about population growth, but he didn't at all. His entire book is trying to work out the detail and give evidence for the many, many different ways in which the potential for human populations to double and double again increasingly quickly, in fact, has never happened, and populations are typically kept, it actually necessarily kept quite low. So his purpose in describing these kinds of relations between men and women were not simply to set them out, but to try and work out what they meant for fertility and mortality. In this instance, male violence, he thought, must bring about frequent miscarriages, he said, quote, preventing the females from being too prolific. He also notes, though with a bit of skepticism via Collins's book, that while a man might have more than one wife, in Aboriginal New South Wales, evidently, he says, only the first wife bore children, and the others became, quote, merely the slave and drudge of both. Although Malthus wonders about this, and he rather thinks that infanticide of the second wife's children more likely than what he calls lack of conjugal embrace. Also, he speculated that nomadic lives are likely limited for fertility too. Quote, the task of rearing one infant in such a wandering and laborious life is troublesome and painful. And all this together forcibly represses the rising generation. In his next chapter of the checks to population among the American Indians, again, he reports low fertility amongst women and how this, what he calls unfruitfulness, has been attributed to, quote, want of ardor in the men towards their women. He thought this entirely possible, and he's gathering information here mainly from William Robertson's earlier histories of America. He thought this entirely possible, perhaps general, but he thought this might be because the food is poor and insufficient. He draws from Robertson's ideas, who explicitly concluded that advance in stages of civilization was signalled by the better position of women. This is very common in this kind of work. William Robertson himself said, and Malthus quotes, quote, in every part of the world, one of the most general characteristics of the savage is to despise and degrade the female sex. This partly manifests, Malthus tells us, with women actually as labourers, enduring incessant toil, he says, while men are idle. He says it's not unknown for this state of degradation to prompt women to kill female infants, quote, to deliver them at once from a life in which they were doomed to such a miserable slavery. In his next chapter on the islands of the South Sea, the third of these fascinating chapters, he details a licentiousness among women, but takes quite a lot of pain to explain from Cook's account, James Cook's account, who was his key source, who seeks to rescue Tahitian women from a reputation that is easily misunderstood. He says the women who thus conduct themselves with licentiousness do not in any respect lower their rank in society, in Tahitian terms, that is. And that's the kind of comment which, for many scholars, has marked Malthus as a kind of an early ethnographer. He was trying to be observational in all of these comments. He was trying to be empirical. We know how flawed his research and his sources were. In these early 3 chapters, he's trying to gather information from first-hand accounts. And so a little unlike, say, Adam Smith's work, where the original state of man is a kind of a hypothetical one, on a hypothetical island, famously. By 1803, Malthus has, you know, all of those French and British expedition and all of their accounts to work from the 1750s onwards. And one of his most favourite sources was Cook's voyage. And these, in fact, here are Malthus's own copies of James Cook's voyage and others. In fact, they're Hawkesworth's compilation of Banks and Cook's accounts. And James Cook, incidentally, was not just a source for Thomas Robert Malthus's work on his chapters on Australia and his chapters on the Pacific. And it's where Thomas Robert Malthus gets a lot of this supposed information from. But even more interestingly for me, there are several times, from memory, 3 times in Malthus's famous essay on population, where Malthus says, the question that I'm asking of the whole world is the question that James Cook asked about Aboriginal people of coastal New Holland. That is to say, given the vast expanse of space, why is the population so sparse? So it's inside Cook's voyage and reading Cook's voyage, having already written his 1798 volume and later being enjoined to write this much bigger world history, and he dives into Cook's voyages and many other work to try and get some of this material. It's there that Thomas Robert Malthus reads Cook asking the question that Malthus himself is asking about population. Why is the population so sparse? With all of this territory, Cook says the population of New South Wales seems to be very low. How can this be the case? And Malthus says, yes, that's exactly what I'm asking of the world. Why isn't the world filled to the brim already, given the potential for human populations to double and double again? What are the checks? And that, he says, it's quite extraordinary, I think. He says the question that Cook asks of the whole world is the question, that Cook asks of New South Wales is the question that I'm asking of the world. But these are the kinds of volumes that Malthus, in writing this what I think of as a world economic history, is trying to work up his material from first-hand accounts of expeditioners and explorers. In the chapter on the South Sea Islanders, Malthus details the exchange of a girl by her parents for a present gifted by the husband, and indicates that this exchange alone is what constitutes marriage. The man may marry again in this way, but apparently cannot bear children with any second wife. This is the kind of detail that he's interested in. That man may indeed even kill the child of a second wife if they are born. In Easter Island, Malthus says there's a great disproportion of males to females, and Malthus has been mining all of these expedition accounts for information on relations between men and women. He says Peruse seemed to think that the women in each district were common property to the men of that district, though Malthus again wonders about that, he's not so sure. In Formosa, he thinks that women were not allowed to reproduce until they were 35, and abortion would be done before that age, and that husbands needed to be 40 before they would have their wives bear children. His environmental argument in all these cases was that the island geography was literally limiting food required or forced such harsh cultural and legal customs in order to keep the population down. Of course, Malthus says there always has to be a check of some sort, and he was documenting how necessary by his law, but also how varied they could be for good and ill. Well, as Malthus moves through his geographically and historically organized chapters from the lowest stages of mankind to ancient Greece and Rome, Persia and Turkey, Indostan and Tibet, Africa, China, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, France, England, Scotland and Wales, and more. There's two core businesses for him, obviously, that drive his famous postulata, sex and land. His book is a social history of human cultures of both, there's no question about it. And the first, about sex, is a kind of a comparative social history of marriage and the family. So let me detail some of that, drawing on some of these other instances. The stadial idea partly documented a differential treatment of women as labourers and reproducers on an axis of civilization. But Malthus was also interested in men as potential and actual heads of households, as well as labourers, and their different capacity to exercise rationality and forethought, which is really key to him, and to consider self-interested consequences by the head of a household on his own behalf and on behalf of his dependents, his wife and children. So this capacity for forethought, for planning ahead, is what constitutes civilization actually for Malthus in many ways. How will a man, he says, transit to his children the same advantages of education and improvement that he had himself possessed? If he has a large family, how can he save them from rags and squalid poverty? If a man does not hold that forethought, he may forfeit his independence and be obliged to the sparing hand of charity. Well, Malthus sought to give us a social history of the ordinary man and woman in all times and all places. So needless to say, his sources are diverse, to say the least, and needless to say, the material that he gathers from these sources are as much mythic as true. At the end of his first book on the lower stages of civilization, so-called, he includes chapters on population in past times, in classical times, in ancient Greece and Rome, and in fact in Sparta, and in barbarian European societies of the late Roman Empire. And as you all know, Adam Smith, in a way, he's copying that model from Smith and from his own classical learning. And so the essay on the principal population is this kind of hilarious book where Malthus's own very diligently footnoted citations go from Cook to Jesuits in China to Tacitus to the Bible. And it's really fun having written a book that is in some ways essentially about Malthus's own footnotes. So when he's writing about the late Roman Empire, he's using Tacitus. Tacitus was especially useful also in the accounts of the inhabitants of ancient Germany. And from Tacitus, he learns that they content themselves almost universally with one wife. Malthus likes the ancient Germans. Their matrimonial bond, he says, is strict and severe, and their manners in this respect deserving of the highest praise. Unlike sexual and marital cultures of various Pacific islands, he says, the ancient Germans, quote, lived in a state of well-guarded chastity, corrupted by no seducing spectacles or convivial incitements, unquote. He tells us adultery is extremely rare and no indulgence is shown to the prostitute. Every mother suckles her own children, that labour is not outsourced. The youths partake late of sexual intercourse. Men and women are usually of equal age at marriage, and this is really interesting to him. This is not a society that has what he calls older men and virgins marrying. Quote, the sexes unite equally matched and equally robust, and so the children inherit the vigour of their parents. All of this he gets from Tacitus. Moving forward in his time to his present, but south geographically to his Orient, he documents a completely different kind of familial arrangement, polygamy common. It's less that he is documenting an immoral state, actually, than thinking through what polygamy does, again, to population numbers. He observes that polygamy multiplies families till many of their branches, he says, sink into the most wretched misery. He describes polygamy as universal across Africa, probably a result, he thinks, of skewed sex ratios, which he thought might be perhaps less about births than death, that women and girls escaped death since they did not participate in wars. How girls or daughters become wives through the decisions of men is documented in great detail. In Tatar societies, he says, all wives are bought off their parents, and also parents keep all their daughters till they can sell them. So Malthus's chapters vary in their focus on land, which is the focus in some chapters, or on mortality and fertility, which is more of a focus in others. His chapter on Persia and Turkey is very interesting. For example, focuses quite a lot on land and its management. His chapter on India and Tibet, by contrast, is immediately about marriage cultures. He says marriage is very greatly encouraged and a male heir is considered as an object of the first importance, gender again. And he quotes Sir William Jones here, unsurprisingly, but William Jones is translating Menu, the Indian legislator. And I think in all of this, we have to remember that, you know, this strange and to me really irritating titling and mocking almost often by people who've never even read the Essay on the Prince Population of Thomas Robert Malthus as the Reverend Malthus, and thereby somehow diminishing him. You know, of course he took orders, and he worked from, you know, a split second. He worked for a split second as a vicar, not very long at all. In fact, he had a cleft palate and a hair lip, and he couldn't speak very well. The whole point of Malthus is less his taking of holy orders and his reverend title than his work and his role in the East India Company College at Haileybury for decades. That is where he worked, that is where he lived. His rooms there with his family were surrounded by his friends and colleagues who were learned Orientalists in that early 19th century way, extraordinary learned linguists in every kind of Middle Eastern and South Asian language, all vernaculars. He understood the generic East, so-called. That was his job for most of his life. So when he's writing chapters on what he calls Hindustan and Tibet, he's knocking, you know, to the linguist next door and getting vernacular translations of most of this literature. That's how we need to understand. And in fact, the colonial context of that is far from immaterial. It's far better to understand Malthus in that context than as the supposed reverend. So he deploys in this chapter on India and Tibet some of his colleagues' work to explain nuptial rites in Hindu culture. an economy of nuptials more about succession of male heirs rather than number of progeny. And he quotes again from Hindu law, by a son, a man obtains victory over all peoples, by a son's son, he enjoys immortality, and afterwards, by the son of that grandson, he reaches the solar abode. The father, having begotten a son, discharges his debt to his own progenitors, he says. And so the comparative social history of family is detailed and structured. A widow, he continues, is on some occasions permitted to have one son by the brother or some appointed kinsman of the deceased husband, but on no account a second. There were many, he said, strict precepts, quote, on the government of the passions. And the precepts affected boys and girls, men and women in specific ways. This is more gender in plain sight. An elder brother, he says, who does not marry confines the younger brother to the same fate, since there's a required order of marriage. For girls, marriageability is about looks and presentation, quote, girls with too little or too much hair, who are too talkative, who have bad eyes, a disagreeable name, or any kind of sickness are excluded. In Northern India, women are not allowed the smallest degree of liberty. That's Malthus's comment. Men and women, boys and girls, male and female, newborns have different value. The infanticide of females in Benares, he notes, is due to, quote, the great expense of procuring suitable matches for their daughters. So there's a gender domestic economy, perhaps unsurprisingly, running through all of this. How young men are enjoined to defer marriage or marry early is of real interest to him, because of course, Malthus's own solution to the repression of population through a check that was ethical in his mind was population-wide later marriages. That's his solution to a higher standard of living in general. Switzerland interested him in this respect. And I think this is a really interesting chapter because it's best described as a study. To me, it was quite a surprising one. And I thank you again for this invitation because it sent me back to read chapters of the essay again that I hadn't read for a really long time. And this chapter on Switzerland is a strange focus on young men's early adulthood, what their various states of employment were likely to be. And this is in Malthus's present, early 19th century, whether they were bonded as workers, whether they were free to move or not, whether they were free to marry or not, and how they would be released from their labor, from their bonds, and given permission to marry. Actually, that chapter is essentially a study of how young men spend their bachelor state, as he puts it, as laborers, and how this, in effect, very effectively actually defers marriage until later. I think perhaps it's a really undervalued chapter in the specific history of demographic transition ideas. Malthus describes in Switzerland really explicitly the alignment of late marriage, low birth rates, and a country of what he calls great healthiness and longevity. And so as I read it, this is an account of, this is a very early account of a demographic transition already having taken place. There's no question that Malthus's world economic history is about the government of gender. He's extremely interested not just in how gender plays out in domestic economies, but also in religious economies. And he wonders which national governments have best sought to regulate gendered conduct and therefore fertility. Tibet is fascinating for him in this regard. And he says it's, quote, perhaps the only country in which government actively encourages the repression of population. That is to say, he thinks it's the only country in which an ethical management for him, of fertility is enforced in various ways. And I have to say, of course, you all know this, that of all of these different ways in which population is kept down, he sees the need to do it ethically as itself a moral mission. And so encouraging governments across the world to induce various means by which young men would marry later is to him a deeply ethical question, because that process itself, he thinks, would prevent a lot of starvation. And so he's really interested when he discovers that, in fact, a government like the Dalai Lama in Tibet is setting up mechanisms by which population, in his terms, can be repressed through the separation of sexes, even momentarily, especially in young adulthood of men. He calls it the sacred separation of sexes in monastery and nunneries. The social religiosity of Tibet produces what is for him a desirable celibacy. The celibacy of the ecclesiasticals, he says, is itself a preventive check. Well, the other main instance of impressive, in his view, government-led or state-managed marriage and reproduction was to be found in Plato's Republic. And again, it's one of these really fun, as a read, hilarious pivots from, Genesis to Plato's Republic to Cook 1776 to Jesuit letters, 1665. So in Plato's Republic, he likes that, quote, excellent men marry excellent women. The proper age of marriage, Plato tells him and he tells us, was 20 for women, 30 for men. And in this republic, men's fertility was regulated. Men's fertility was regulated. They should have children only between the age of 30 and 35. All this was managed by magistrates, he tells us, by the state. And he reads this management actually as evidence that Plato understood the need to limit population to subsistence levels. He says, quote, his expedients for checking it are indeed execrable. Nonetheless, Plato understands the problem. And Aristotle also, he says, recommended marriage at 37 for men, 18 for women, and thought the number of children should be regulated. To the extent, he tells us, Aristotle says, that women should be able to have abortions before the fetus has life, Malthus says. Men should cease having children at 55 or 54, according to Aristotle, Malthus tells us. Aristotle saw that, quote, the strong tendency of the human race to increase, unless checked by strict and positive laws, is always in action. So, so he certainly kind of authorizes his own principle with that classical work. Of course, the essay is riddled with easily identifiable problematic presumptions about gender roles and rules in other cultures. It would be, and this is quite important, I think it would be a very easy historical endeavour simply to offer a critique of how Malthus presents gender, the conduct of men and women. It would be straightforward, too easy to simply critique how Malthus presents gender in cultures other than his own, as well as in his own. Of course, this all came to be called Orientalist and is, not to mention, racist. But for me these days, this is almost to be taken as read. More difficult, I think, is to suspend sometimes quite predictable critique of Malthus and pay attention to what his purpose was. Misunderstandings based on the is-ought distinction, I think, are often at play when people read Malthus in particular. People traditionally read Malthus as describing and proposing the way things ought to be, or even have to be. But I think in this world economic history that is the essay on the Principal Population, he actually imagined himself, however flawed, to be faithfully documenting not the way things ought to be, but the way things are. Documenting what is, what not what ought to be. And so, in fact, although it's entirely obvious how problematic, offensive, difficult, egregious so many of these statements are, it's also continually slightly surprising to me, actually, how reserved on the whole Malthus was in this essay, even about infanticide in other cultures and his own. He writes quite a lot about infanticide in England, even about things like cannibalism, in fact. He sees these things as forced, in a way, by geographic or what we would call environmental circumstance that makes the production of food difficult. And so almost every time he talks about excessive war or infanticide, and occasionally about cannibalism, more often than not, he then goes to explain that by the pressure and necessity of finding food. Slavery also he presents as a matter of historical and economic fact. You know, and this is difficult because given the massive public and political debate about the British slave trade right then in the first decades of the 19th century, perhaps Malthus should have offered a firmer opinion. And the fascinating omission of the West Indies in his world history is something that I dealt with in the book with Joyce Chaplin, and we can certainly discuss that in questions if you wish. But for the moment, I want to signal the extent to which, in Malthus's study of the economies of gender and of families, the family was unsurprisingly a household, and unsurprisingly, that included servants and apprentices and slaves. So there's a gendered domestic economy of slaveholding and selling that is detailed all the way through the book. Men as heads of households and masters were explicitly gendered economic actors. In China, he says the master of a household counts slaves within the household, he tells us, but generally discourages their reproduction or their breeding. Tartars would sell their slaves or their wives and children as slaves to get themselves through famine times, he tells us. At other times, quote, female captives would supply the place of wives. He documents and is really interested in people who sell themselves into slavery to avoid famine, exchanging their own labor for food. And interestingly, he says this aligns with changes that he perceives around him in his own England, people who are selling their own labor for food. Roman slavery, on the other hand, he thought economically ill-considered. He describes an excess population in classical Rome, in ancient Rome, the large number of redundant poor. The poor, he says, would have, quote, no recourse to prevent them from starving, but that of selling their labor to the rich, as in modern states, he says. But there was no opportunity to do so, since the number of slaves in Rome, he says, filled and more than filled that labor demand. They filled every employment in agriculture and manufactures. There were too many slaves. Ordinarily then, he says, one would expect the number of poor but free citizens to diminish, but the poor were supported by a charity, by a custom of distributing corn to the poorer citizens gratis. But this was inadequate and they just stayed poor. And of course, this is, you know, corn laws are everywhere in this. He says if half of the slaves in ancient Rome had been sent out of the country and the people had been employed in agriculture and manufactures, the effect would have been to increase the number of Roman citizens with more certainty and rapidity than 10,000 laws for the encouragement of children. Well, let me then turn just briefly to the occasional, more than occasional, really, alignment of war and gender, war and masculinity for Malthus. The essay is about gender in that it's centrally about population fertility, reproduction and marriage and households, as we've seen. But it was also about gender via another check altogether, and that was war. Through intermittent discussion of war, Malthus details different cultures and codes of masculinity. Actually, in a great deal of detail, he describes different kinds of virility, different kinds of masculine honor. In this chapter, his chapter on the Americas, for example, he spends a good deal of time explaining modes of warfare that he thinks held no kind of masculine virtue, no kind of honor and gallantry, they're his terms. Native American warriors, he says, are cunning, not open, and they seek to kill each other entirely, not just to win authority in battles. He says the great object, quote, of the most renowned warrior is by every art of cunning and deceit, by every mode of stratagem and surprise, to weaken his enemies. To meet an enemy on equal terms is regarded as extreme folly. Instead, they lie in wait until the enemy is least able to resist, unquote. So the point is to kill. But again, although he clearly doesn't approve of this masculine, dishonorable kind of warfare, it's a mode, he explains again, by the circumstances of available subsistence, another means by which population is necessarily kept down. The essay on the principle of population is in part a book about how men across the world kill each other, from the ferocity of Goths and Huns, to Tartars' petty incursions, he said, in which wives and daughters of enemies are carried away. The military is interesting for him in other terms. I put this beautiful plate from Cook's voyage up for you because Malthus makes a point of noting that when Cook wanted to estimate the number of people in Tahiti and in New Zealand, he did so by counting the number of men on the war canoes, and in the traditional style, multiply that by 4 to get the number of people in across the country. So the kind of military style, military base of a census is something that Malthus applied to, say, the islands of the South Sea after Cook. Standing armies are really important to him as well. They were one way in which population could be checked by deferring marriage again. And this is again men as economic actors. In Denmark and Norway, the management of young men in the military kept marriage rates low, he said, compared to elsewhere in Europe. Every man born of a farmer or a labourer is a soldier for a period, but special permission is required to marry while serving. And that special permission constituted enough hurdles to be disincentive enough to defer men's marriages. And just quickly, a final domain in which we find gender in Malthus's essay, less expected or less commonly understood to be about masculinity, is his interest in inheritance of land and primogeniture. The land inheritance of firstborn sons, or all sons, in effect either kept large landholding intact or divided land into small holdings, and this affected crops or pastures, that is to say, food for human consumption. In Norway, for example, he noted that land remains divided into large farms, but he notes also the seemingly contradictory law of succession that dictates all brothers divide property equally from a father. And in this instance, fertility itself he thinks was deliberately restricted in order to offset the land division problem. Because he noted, and this was firsthand, he did a long tour through Denmark and Norway, that farms were still quite large, and he thought this was an indication of how slowly the population had therefore increased. In China, by contrast, increasingly small properties are inherited by all sons. Tiny parcels of land characterize Chinese agriculture, and he has a number of reasons for this. On the coast of Malabar, he says people don't enter into regular marriages at all, he explains, and the right of inheritance succession rests through a complicated, not patrilineal line, but rests or otherwise goes to the sister's son. This is because the father of the child actually is always considered uncertain in a culture where there's no clear marriage. And so, this is Malthus, both the social historian and anthropologist. Well, let me just conclude then. Many commentators on Malthus, not often economic historians at all, make the major error of analysing Malthus's essay as a kind of a naturalising of poverty, of apparently inevitable checks. But in fact, the whole long study details, as we've seen, the multiple varying, and then this is really important, manipulable, these are all changeable modes of human social arrangement and government. That's what he's setting out here. All the different means by which in the past and present our population has been repressed, he would say. These are all available to mitigate or minimize the number of people without food. Some of them are ethical, some of them are unethical, some are desirable, some are undesirable. We might even read the essay as only about the possibility of changing social, economic, and political responses to this permanent potential for human population to grow beyond food. Understanding how those processes were different across economies and across the world, and different between and amongst men and women. All of this was Malthus's bread and butter in this famous, enduring, never out of publication book. Of course, there's a well-established field of feminist economics and economic history to draw on here, and perhaps a less developed intellectual history tradition about thinking through Enlightenment stadial theory and universal histories, and the classical canon of political economy through gender. But my inclination these days is a little different to that literature. It's less to make, in some ways, it's actually less to make a political point by foregrounding gender than simply an empirical one. Not considering gender is, on the one hand, at the very least for me these days, a massive missed conceptual opportunity. But even putting that aside, I think what's even more foundational is that it's simply an empirical error. I'm struck increasingly by the simple fact that often past historical actors and thinkers, including those in the political economy canon, considered gender far more often, far more fully, and much more explicitly than almost all subsequent analysts of them. And that's simply at an empirical level. This is insufficient. The gap between the every page prominence of gender, at least in this Malthus text and in the political economy of population sequence that follows, and the disinclination to analyse the early political economists via gender, or even as historians or theorists of gender, increasingly interests me. It's so often insufficient and even, I think, erroneous, well, demonstrably erroneous, not to inquire into how men and women were considered, constructed, instructed, symbolised, or valued in this canon. Classical political economists and their universal historian or stadial theory predecessors, especially of the Scottish Enlightenment, including Adam Smith, considered gender quite often, even if it's in terms with which we would now almost universally disagree. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alison. That's terrific. We've got some time for questions. So who would like to start us off, please? Well, oh, sorry, Simon, you go ahead. And then Paul. Good.
Thanks. That was fantastic, Alison. Really, really enjoyed it ever so much. Thank you. I haven't looked at Malthus for years now. It's not my area at all, but I'd forgotten how many countries and areas and so forth that he drew upon. One thing that I maybe didn't understand was that it seems from what you're saying that he very heavily drew upon other authors and writers. Is there much in terms of his own direct observational input into that? I guess that would be one question. The other is, I'm wondering, is this an opportunity to revisit some of the other classical economists and, you know, see what they were saying about gender, even if they didn't use the term? I wonder whether gender they sort of didn't really think of as much as family history. So anyhow, just a few thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yeah, so his sources. So he's, you know, just a whiz. It's such a romp, you know, reading for the likes of us, only for historians, not for the world, you know. It's such a romp to read through his footnotes and see who he's using. I mean, it's really interesting, and it's, you know, it's everybody, and I've documented a lot of them, but he's trying, the closer he comes to his own time and place, the more direct observational he gets. So, you know, he uses all of these expedition accounts, and he uses quite a lot of East India Company College material where he gets a bit more what we would think of as proper circa 1803 data about, you know, marriages and births and deaths from his East India Company, which obviously has their finger on that button. When he comes closer to, you know, his accounts of China, he uses the embassy to China, who's the Macartney embassy, that's the late 18th century attempt to bring on the Chinese emperor. He uses those accounts, and he uses Jesuit letters, you know, from the century before for all of his detail. And interestingly, for historians, he does this strange thing where he sees the Jesuit letters, say on China, he sees the Jesuit letters from, let's say, 1660, and the Macartney expedition account from, when is that, that comes out 1790 or something like that. There's a jarring thing for us reading it as historians, because he sees them as equally valid, that because he doesn't have a sense that China would have changed from then to now. He doesn't have a sense, but also he thinks that China is one of the few countries in the world where it's filled with population and it can't get more or less populated. So he conflates these, and the Bible, and he puts the stories of who are the brothers with the cattle that go, I'm so hopeless when it comes to religious scholarship, who go separate ways, who have to, Abram and someone or other. And he uses that story as the reason why, as the kind of initial population pressure or search for land because there were too many cattle between the brothers and one of the brothers has to move. And this is where the world starts getting popular. And he uses that, and then he'll go straight to immigration schemes that have just been put to Parliament. So he just folds all of these things together. But I think especially for economic historians, the closer he comes to his own place and time, the more recognizable tables come into his essay. And, some of them are fairly extensive. And obviously the data on England, he's got lots of tables on the plague. And it becomes a more recognizable presentation of data that he's getting firsthand. And the only other thing that is quite interesting is that his chapters on Scandinavia are all drawn from a long tour that he did there in 1799. And we have his notebooks from that tour. And that's where you can see him essentially being an ethnographer. He's looking at what people actually eat. He's looking at what's on the table. He's staying with households and he's documenting how many sons and daughters there are. And so he's trying to gather up his own data in that instance. So it's such a fascinating mishmash of from the scriptural to the ethnographic.
Can I just jump in with a related question? Paul, just excuse me for a moment. I'll give you the floor in a second.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. Go ahead.
Just following up from Simon's point. Alison, I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about his time at Haileybury and that he was in fact an economist, not a clergyman. It got me thinking about his relationship with Ricardo. Have you had any thoughts about how that, because they really brought the best out in each other because they were quite civil and there was a dynamic interaction between them as they put their different views. So I just wondering if you thought about that.
No, absolutely. And right then I was just thinking about how you talked about how Noel Butlin appreciated disputes over views, because we know that this is, they obviously disagree in a great way, but had the most enormous gentlemanly respect for one another. And on a kind of a biographical level, occasionally Malthus would go over to it's Ricardo who lived in, am I right? It's Ricardo lived in what is now Princess Anne's Gloucestershire home. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. And so there were letters where occasionally Malthus would go over there and be a house guest, and it was incredibly cordial for two people who had such massive disagreement. And there, I have to say, there is a quip in the book where I write that although Malthus is writing about the world, all time and all place, sitting in from his armchair like they all did, and reaching up to his shelves, which were closer than this, to pull down Cook or to pull down the Jesuit letters or whatever. And so he travelled the world through all of these other accounts, but there are so many letters where Ricardo is inviting him over to Gloucestershire, and Malthus says, I can't, there's just too much going on in my life, essentially. I can't possibly think of travelling that far, ask me again next summer. And so there's this very a friendly, gentlemanly relation between them, and I do think they brought out the best in one another. But it is also, to kind of descend into the biographical here, what was very clear in writing the book and in reading through Malthus's letters, actually, as well as his published material, was his correspondence is not extensive, but Malthus was an incredibly cordial. Everybody liked him. Everybody liked the man, and all of his correspondence and people who wrote about him may have hated what he said, but they always would say, but I really like him and I would like to invite him over for dinner. So in a way, that's the kind of Ricardo relationship. And so it's a model actually for major intellectual disagreement and friendship at the same time.
Sure, thanks. Now, Paul, you go ahead.
Well, that's fine. It was Abraham and Lot, by the way, with the cattle.
Thank you, of course.
No, that's
I've just declared myself. Yes.
I've got a couple of things I'm a bit mystified and concerned about in the lecture. The first one is your concentration on the 1803 edition rather than the anonymous 1798 edition. I don't know whether that's, I've dipped into parts of your 2016 book, but I haven't read the whole thing. I'd be really interested in any comments you have on your view of the relationship between the two, and in particular, whether how much the very explicit agenda in the first edition against Condorcet and Godwin and seeking a more realistic program for minimising famine, how much that carries over into the second edition, because that would seem to be somewhat in tension with your idea about Malthus's writing a world economic history. I don't know whether it is. It seems to me in tension anyway. So that's the first query, really about the relationship between the first and the second editions. And the second one, I guess an annoyance, the way that you minimise the role of Malthus as a clergyman. I just find that a bit strange, given that Malthus had extensive theological training at Cambridge, took the trouble to write several chapters of theology in the first essay, trying to reconcile its conclusions with what he understood to be traditional Anglican doctrine. And then I think most of all, the sermons that were recently discovered and edited, 2 thick CUP volumes of sermons and correspondence, mostly about religious matters, edited by John Butlin. I just really struggle to see how you can be engaging with themes like the filling of the earth, gender relations, without taking seriously the theological dimensions of Malthus. I don't know whether that was just a few offhand comments in the lectures which annoyed me, which were not representative of your mature and considered views. But I'd be interested in your view of the role of Malthus' theological background in things like the filling of the earth and gender relations, which you've talked about in the lecture.
Yep. Okay, thank you. So the filling of the earth is in fact what constitutes, and his quotidian understanding, along with everybody else, irrespective of his theological training. I mean, you don't need to be theologically trained to believe in the Genesis rendition of filling the earth, is what drives the chapter on the Americas in the book. And so that's quite explicitly about that thesis in the work that led up to Malthus and through it. So I disagree that, is theology there? Oh, in what I was talking about today? No. Do I get annoyed and irritated by the demonstrable diminution of unlearned people's characterization of Malthus as reverend? It happens all the time. That's not me diminishing, that's me expressing an irritation that people who have no idea of what Malthus wrote imagine that they disagree, imagine him as evil, and diminish and mock him by calling him the Reverend. I completely stand by what I said about his undervalued status as Professor of Political Economy in the East India Company College. So it seems to me that it is a standard understanding of Malthus. So everybody understands that Malthus is a clergyman. Everybody who knows anything about 18th and 19th century British history appreciates, with different levels of expertise, that there is a theology driving all of this. Very few people write about Malthus in the context of the East India Company College, where he's drawing all that into almost everything that he says. I'm actually counter to what you say. Actually, I'm one of the people who has argued that it is the theology it's the theological controversy in the essay on the principal population that is what drove the controversy about the essay in the first instance. Most scholars of Malthus actually want to read him backwards through Marx, and they want to read him backwards through Marx and Godwin and so forth, and they want to say it's an unethical position about class and poverty and so forth. But in fact, I'm on record as saying, there is, of course, that tradition of critique, but in fact, that tradition of critique often ignores the other element of great controversy for Malthus, which was precisely that for the established Church of England, and he's only just into the established Church of England. In fact, he comes from a really interesting evangelical, a dissenting academy.
Yes,
he
absolutely.
only just scrapes into the established church, and it's actually still not entirely clear how he gets to take holy orders, because he's educated in a dissenting academy. And his father is a friend of Rousseau, and Rousseau and atheists are the late 18th century atheists are the people who are his friends' guests. So how this man goes from the dissenting academy, a family who is entertaining Rousseau whenever Rousseau is in London, just scrapes in to the low-ranking Jesus College, despite the evangelical and non-conformist and dissenting traditions, and still comes out with holy orders. That's the interesting question about Malthus, that in fact we address in the book. So I think, it's a mischaracterization to say there's no theology in there. Is there a theology about gender? Yes. One of the other thing that interests me, actually, that always surprised me, and I touched on this, is that despite everyday moral positions of someone of his, middling gentlemanly class, this is not a rich family at all, they're just landowning. Despite the morals of that class, despite having taken holy orders, when Malthus writes about something like infanticide in the essay on the principal population, he's not taking the opportunity to tell us how outrageous, unethical, irreligious, and unchristian the heathens are in this practice. He doesn't do that. And in fact, to go to your question of the number of editions, in the later editions, he puts a footnote into his discussion of infanticide, where he's essentially saying, I know some of you seem to think that I think infanticide's okay. Clearly I don't. Nonetheless, I am of the opinion that there's this is paraphrasing, there's an environmental cause for this. So, there is a way in which there's a classical theology through all of this. There's a really edge, there's a way in which he's not a theologian. He's taken holy orders, which is standard for Cambridge. Everybody did it. So he's not special, actually, in that regard. And then he doesn't really practice as a vicar. He doesn't do it, chooses not to. There's a number of reasons why. But really, he's just on the edge of some pretty difficult and controversial positions when it comes to the established church of that moment.
I have to call time. I'm extremely sorry. This has been a wonderful discussion and a wonderful lecture to stimulate that discussion. So thank you very much, Alison. And I'm just waiting with bated breath for the paper to come out. So could you all join me in thanking Alison, please? Yep, thank you very much. David, is it okay if we start 5 minutes late, the final session? I hope you can all come to the final session. Start in 5?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll stop the recording now and then we'll reset the recording because it's the same link.
Yeah, okay.